Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question. What if even your sleeping body could get you punished for sin? Welcome to the medieval monastery, where desire wasn't just forbidden, it was stalked, catalogued, and beaten down with scratchy robes, empty stomachs, and an unhealthy obsession with what happened under your blanket at night. Forget Hollywood monks. The real ones lived in a constant war with biology. Before we get too deep into this, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of history we're building here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wild to see this sleepy community stretching from Australia at sunrise to Canada at midnight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Congratulations, you've just woken up in a monastery dormitory in the year 1325. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're already in trouble. Your bed isn't a bed at all. It's a rough wooden plank topped with straw that smells faintly of damp hay and strongly of the person who slept here before you. Your wool blanket is scratchy, heavy, and smells like a goat that lost a fight with mildew. Privacy doesn't exist. Dozens of other monks are lined up in rows beside you, their snores echoing like a chorus of clogged bagpipes. And every move you make is being silently judged, not just by your brothers, but, in theory, by God himself. You stretch, but instantly regret it. The robe wrapped around you feels like wearing sandpaper. That's the point. The fabric was chosen to make sure you never feel too comfortable, because comfort leads to pleasure, and pleasure leads to sin. You're not supposed to think about your body at all, which of course means you think about it constantly. Here's a fun fact. Medieval monks weren't just told to avoid sex. They were expected to avoid even impure thoughts. Yes, even in their dreams. Nocturnal emissions, the kind of thing modern science just chalks up to biology, were recorded as sins. Imagine waking up and realizing you had broken a vow in your sleep. Time to confess to your superior that your body betrayed you while you were unconscious. Good morning. And the rules didn't stop there. Meals were deliberately bland. Garlic, onions and spices were avoided because they were thought to inflame the senses. You were fed thin pottage, dry bread, and the occasional bit of salted fish. The goal wasn't nutrition. The goal was to keep you too weak and too hungry to get frisky. Silence was another weapon. Talking was restricted, partly to encourage prayer, but mostly to stop you from making bawdy jokes or forming too close friendships. Human connection itself was seen as dangerous. The closer you grew to another monk, the more suspicion you invited. Even sitting beside someone too often could be called inappropriate attachment. And then there was fasting. Long stretches without food weren't just about piety, they were about crushing desire. The idea was simple. An empty stomach left no energy for lust. Unfortunately, it also left no energy for much of anything else, including walking straight or thinking clearly. You'd stumble through your duties half dizzy, praying that exhaustion counted as holiness. Still, scandals happened. Monastic records are full of stories about monks sneaking out to brothels, or being caught in compromising situations with each other. The punishments ranged from extra fasting to public humiliation to outright expulsion. Each case reinforced the idea that human desire was an enemy lurking inside your very skin. So here you are, hungry, itchy and guilty before you've even had breakfast. Every twitch of your body is suspect, every passing thought an accusation, and every mistake another tally on the long list of sins. The walls aren't just made of stone, they're made of silence, shame, and a lifetime of rules that try to turn your body into a cage for your own soul. And if you think that's bleak, wait until you learn how monks dealt with friendships. Because in the medieval monastery, even kindness could be considered dangerous. You're still in the monastery dormitory, the wool robe itching against your skin, when another rule comes into sharp focus. It's not enough to control your body in the privacy of your bed. You also have to control your heart, or at least anything that might look like affection. Because in the eyes of medieval monastic rules, friendship itself could be as suspicious as lust. The logic went something like this. If monks grew too close, temptation might creep in. Bonds of loyalty might override loyalty to God. And of course, The church feared that intimacy of any kind could lead to sins of the flesh, so the safest answer was to smother friendship before it ever got too warm. In fact, monastic statutes across Europe warned specifically against particular friendships. The idea was that monks should be equally friendly to all and never show favouritism. Sharing food, sitting together too often, or even laughing too much with the same person could draw criticism. You were supposed to love everyone in a vague, holy sense, but never care too much about anyone in particular. Imagine middle school lunch tables patrolled by priests, except the punishment wasn't detention. It was fasting and public humiliation, and it wasn't paranoia without teeth. In some monasteries, 2 monks caught spending too much time together were separated like misbehaving students. Chronic offenders could be forced into solitary cells. Some records even show accusations of particular friendship being used as a weapon during disputes. If someone wanted to drag you down, all they had to do was point out how much time you spent walking beside brother so-and-so. Congratulations, you now had a reputation problem that might follow you for years. Historical sources back this up. The Cistercians, a strict order founded in the 12th century, were especially suspicious of friendships. Their rulebook discouraged monks from sharing beds, meals, or private conversations. Even the Benedictine rule, which formed the foundation of much medieval monastic life, emphasized community over individuality, warning against anything that might break the unity of the cloister. The logic was simple but suffocating. If everyone is equally distant, no one can get too close. Of course, human beings being what they are, monks still formed bonds. You cannot pack dozens of men into the same cloister and expect no friendships to form. Letters between monks that survive from the period show warmth, longing, and occasional coded hints at feelings deeper than spiritual brotherhood. Some were harmless, others hint at scandals that rocked monasteries and embarrassed abbots, who scrambled to cover them up. The punishments for crossing the line varied. At best, you might be lectured and reassigned to new duties. At worst, you could be beaten, exiled, or even turned over to secular authorities if the relationship was deemed criminal. And since the medieval church had a talent for cataloguing sins in excruciating detail, there was no shortage of categories your behaviour could fall under. Impure thought, indecent touch, sodomy, or the all-purpose favourite, unchastity. Now imagine living under that kind of scrutiny day after day. You sit in the refectory for a meal of cold pottage and black bread. You feel the eyes of the abbot scanning the benches, making sure no 2 monks lean in too close. You keep your face blank, your voice even, and your spoon moving in the same rhythm as everyone else, because showing too much warmth to another human being might earn you suspicion. The irony is that medieval monasteries were built on community. You worked together, ate together, prayed together, and slept in the same room. Yet the rules demanded that those bonds remain shallow, because deeper affection was dangerous. It was the ultimate contradiction. Be a brother to all, but never a friend to one. And this fear of friendship didn't stop at the monastery door. Outside, society was just as anxious about same-sex intimacy. In many parts of Europe, laws against sodomy carried brutal punishments, ranging from mutilation to execution. Monks weren't exempt. If anything, they were held to an even higher standard. The combination of surveillance, guilt, and paranoia created a pressure cooker. And in a pressure cooker, steam always finds a way out. When scandals did break, they could be explosive. Chronicles record abbots resigning in disgrace after rumours spread of improper relationships within their cloisters. Some monasteries earned reputations as hotbeds of immorality, drawing criticism from reformers who demanded stricter rules and harsher punishments. In some cases, entire orders doubled down, creating even more suffocating regulations to stamp out what they saw as corruption. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The more the church obsessed over controlling desire, the more evidence we find of monks breaking those rules. The tighter the grip, the more scandals slipped through their fingers, and while sermons thundered against the dangers of fleshly temptation, monasteries continued to struggle with the same very human impulses they tried to deny. So here you are, sitting in the dim cloister, knowing that a smile or shared joke might land you in trouble. The incense clings to your robe, your stomach growls with hunger, and your only safe companions are the stone walls around you. But even they seem to whisper, not with comfort, but with the endless echo of rules that make friendship feel like a crime. And if you think friendships were tightly policed, wait until you discover how monks handled the act of confession. Because when it came to your most private thoughts, nothing stayed private for long. You sit in the cloister and realise that the most terrifying part of your daily routine hasn't even begun. It is not the hunger, or the scratchy wool, or the endless chanting. It is confession. The moment when your thoughts, the ones you desperately wanted to keep private, are dragged into the open. In medieval monasteries, confession was not an occasional ritual. For monks, it could be daily, sometimes even multiple times a day, depending on the order. The logic was simple. If you confessed your sins immediately, you could not hide them. If you could not hide them, you could not act on them. What it meant in practice was living in a state of constant surveillance, where even your unconscious mind was fair game. Historical records show just how detailed these confessions were expected to be. The Benedictine rule emphasized not just deeds, but thoughts. The Cistercians doubled down, cataloguing sins in precise categories so there was no wiggle room. Did you have an impure thought while washing your hands? Confess it. Did you feel warmth in your chest while talking to another monk? Confess it. Did you dream of anything less than holy? Confess it. The result was a culture where the only thing more exhausting than battling desire was reporting your failures to battle it. Confessors were trained to probe for specifics. Some manuals survive, offering priest-suggested questions to root out sins of the flesh. They asked about glances, touches, fantasies, even the kind of dreams monks had. One 13th century confession manual written for Dominican friars instructed confessors to ask about the circumstances of nocturnal emissions and whether the monk's imagination had been complicit. Imagine the awkward silence as you explain to your superior that your unconscious thoughts refused to behave. This constant interrogation did more than humiliate. It created paper trails. Monastic records survive of monks accused not because they were caught in the act, but because their own confessions revealed too much. Your honesty became evidence against you, and your own words could limit your future. Some monks were denied advancement in the order because of repeated failings. Others were punished with stricter fasting, heavier penances, or removal from communal duties. And this obsession with self-reporting wasn't limited to monasteries. Across medieval Europe, the act of confessing every thought became central to Christian practice. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated annual confession for all Christians. For monks, the expectation was far harsher. By the 14th century, some orders recommended weekly or even daily scrutiny, creating an environment where the human mind itself felt like contraband. The impact on daily life was enormous. Imagine the pressure of knowing that every stray thought must be catalogued. You're scrubbing floors, your back aching, and your mind wanders to the memory of a warm bed or a smile from years ago. Immediately you feel the sting of guilt. You rehearse how you will confess it later, trying to choose words that will sound appropriately remorseful without drawing extra suspicion. It is not holiness. It is self-policing so intense that guilt becomes your default state. The humour here, if you can call it that, is in the sheer absurdity of it all. Medieval monks believed that the devil lurked not in the tavern or the brothel, but in the folds of your mind. Your brain was a battlefield, and every stray image was treated like a foreign invader. It was spiritual border control, but instead of guards at the gate, there was a confessor in the cloister with a notebook of sins. And let us not forget the physical punishments tied to confession. Some orders prescribed whipping as penance, a practice monks often carried out on themselves. It was thought that pain purged desire, much like hunger did. A few strokes for a sinful thought, a longer session for repeated failures. Picture a monk in a candlelit cell, scourging his own back not because he acted on lust, but because he imagined it. That was the level of detail confession demanded. It is worth noting that not every monk accepted this system without question. Surviving letters and sermons reveal frustration with the endless cycle of guilt and confession. Some admitted that confessing in pure dreams felt meaningless, since no one could control what happened in sleep. Others pointed out that the constant focus on sin made monks think about sex more, not less. It was the medieval version of telling someone not to think about pink elephants, ensuring that is all they can imagine. Confession manuals even reveal the church's obsession with cataloguing sins in a kind of medieval filing cabinet. There were sins of thought, sins of word, sins of touch, sins of omission. Each had its category, each its corresponding punishment. The result was a spiritual bureaucracy where your soul was itemized like goods in a warehouse. And just as in any bureaucracy, paperwork piled high. Now place yourself back in that moment. You're on your knees in the confessional, the scent of old incense in your nose, the stone floor cold beneath you. You whisper your sins, and as you speak them aloud, you hear them echo in your own ears. They sound worse when spoken. You feel smaller, weaker, guilty not just for the thought, but for being the kind of person who had it. You wait for the penance to be assigned. Another fast, another whipping, another week of silence. You rise, lighter in some ways but heavier in others, because you know you'll be back tomorrow, confessing again. And as the cycle repeats day after day, the line between sin and existence begins to blur. Desire is not just punished when acted upon. It is punished simply for being felt. Your body itself feels like contraband. And your mind becomes a prison with no locked door because the confessional is always waiting. But while confession policed your thoughts, there was another weapon used to control desire, one far more physical and inescapable. It was the discipline of the body through fasting, flagellation, and the deliberate denial of comfort. And that is where the monastery's war against the flesh truly sharpened its teeth. The monastery had no illusions about desire being easy to control. Thoughts might be dragged into confession, but the body had to be disciplined into submission. This was done with a simple, brutal logic. If the flesh was weak, the spirit might stand a chance. And so monks lived under a regime of fasting, flagellation, and relentless discomfort, all designed to keep lust at bay. Food was the first line of attack. Meals were intentionally stripped of anything remotely stimulating. Garlic, onions, and spices were suspected of stirring up the senses. Instead, monks were fed pottage so bland it barely counted as food, bread so coarse it scratched the mouth, and watery ale brewed weak enough to disappoint even a desperate teenager at a house party. Records from the 13th century show that many monasteries rationed meat severely, sometimes banning it entirely except for the sick. The idea was not just frugality but suppression of desire, since meat was thought to heat the body and inflame lust. The portions themselves were carefully measured. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed 2 cooked dishes per meal, and allowed a third if available, but never enough to fully satisfy hunger. Hunger was a form of armour. A monk with an empty stomach, the logic went, would have no energy left for temptation. It was a crude but persistent belief, echoed in sermons and medical treatises alike. Medieval medicine, still rooted in the theory of the 4 humours, warned that certain foods increased passion by warming the blood. So the diet became a form of chemical warfare against lust. The results, unsurprisingly, were miserable. Accounts from visiting outsiders often described monks as gaunt, pale, and perpetually exhausted. Some were so underfed that their health visibly declined. Yet the suffering was seen as proof of holiness. To endure constant hunger was to show that you valued the spirit over the body. That it also kept monks too tired to get into trouble was treated as divine coincidence. But fasting was only part of the arsenal. When hunger wasn't enough, pain took over. Monks practiced flagellation, the ritual of whipping themselves to drive out sinful urges. This was not an occasional punishment, but a regular discipline in some orders. Imagine rows of monks in a candlelit chapel, robes stripped to reveal backs scarred with old welts, each lashing himself in rhythm with the chanting of psalms. The whips varied, from simple leather cords to ropes knotted with beads of wood or even bits of iron. The idea was that each stroke weakened the flesh and purified the soul. Historians note that flagellation was not unique to monks. It spread across Europe, especially during times of crisis. The Black Death saw entire movements of flagellants marching from town to town, whipping themselves publicly as a form of penance. But in monasteries the practice was woven into the rhythm of daily life. A lustful thought could earn extra lashes. A nocturnal emission might be followed by a night in the cell with a scourge. Pain became both punishment and prophylactic, a way to remind the body who was in charge. The irony is that the practice often had the opposite effect. Contemporary critics complained that public whipping sometimes stirred more curiosity than shame. Watching rows of half-naked men lashing themselves in unison could, paradoxically, create the very temptation the ritual was meant to banish. It was the medieval equivalent of banning fire drills because too many people enjoyed watching them. Even outside of whipping, daily discomfort was carefully engineered. Robes were made of coarse wool, chosen not for warmth but for irritation. They trapped sweat in summer, froze solid in winter, and rubbed the skin raw. Beds were wooden planks with straw, just soft enough to prevent death but not soft enough to invite indulgence. Heating was minimal, because warmth was thought to make the body lazy and the mind prone to sin. Monks slept in communal dormitories with no curtains or partitions, so privacy was eliminated as thoroughly as comfort. Add to this the architectural choices of monasteries themselves. Stone walls held in damp air, making cloisters cold and clammy for much of the year. Light came from small windows or candles that filled the air with smoke. The environment itself became a weapon, a constant reminder that the monastery was not built for the body's ease but for its control. You were not meant to thrive here, you were meant to endure, and endure they did, though not always willingly. Some chronicles mention monks sneaking food, hoarding scraps of meat, or sneaking off to warm themselves by forbidden fires. Others describe abbots cracking down with renewed severity whenever indulgence was discovered. The result was a cycle of deprivation and rebellion, with the human body always resisting its own captivity. One particularly telling fact is that some monasteries kept detailed records of penances assigned for bodily failings. These included extended fasts, extra scourging, or being forced to sleep on bare floors without blankets. The logic was always the same. The body was the root of sin, and the more it suffered, the more the soul might rise above it. Yet the very existence of these punishments proves how often the body refused to cooperate. Imagine your own day under such conditions. You shuffle to the refectory, your stomach a hollow drum, to sip broth so thin it might as well be hot water. You return to your cell, where the robe scratches like nettles and the air bites with cold. At night you scourge yourself in the chapel until your skin stings, then collapse onto straw that smells faintly of mildew. You close your eyes, desperate for sleep, only to wake with guilt because your dreams dared to betray you. It is a cycle without end, a life designed not to nurture but to break. Yet the system endured for centuries, producing men who believed, or at least hoped, that suffering itself was a path to holiness. The hunger, the pain, the endless discomfort were not failures of design. They were the design. And for the medieval monk, desire was never defeated, only beaten into exhaustion. Still, the war against lust was not fought with the body alone. It was also fought with the mind. Through endless prayer, chanting and meditation meant to scrub away temptation. And as you will soon discover, even prayer itself was shaped less by devotion and more by the fear of what might happen if your mind wandered. You rise from the cold straw, your body stiff from fasting and flagellation, and shuffle into the chapel. The air is heavy with candle smoke, and the faint scent of wax mixes with the damp stone walls. Rows of monks line the choir stalls, robes scratching against their skin, voices low and steady. This is the next weapon in the monastery's arsenal against lust. Endless prayer and chanting, designed not just to praise God, but to drown out the dangerous whispers of the mind. Monastic life revolved around the divine office, a strict schedule of prayers recited at fixed hours throughout the day and night. 7 times, sometimes more, the bells rang, dragging monks from their work, their sleep, even their meagre meals to chant psalms in Latin. The logic was simple. If your day was filled with sacred words, there would be no time for sinful thoughts. Prayer became not just devotion, but thought control. The Benedictine rule set the foundation in the 6th century, prescribing exact hours for services like matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, and vespers at sunset. By the medieval period, the schedule had hardened into routine. Monks could expect to be woken in the dead of night for long sessions of chanting that sometimes lasted until dawn. Sleep deprivation was not an accident. It was a feature. Tired men were less likely to dream vividly, less likely to feel temptation, and less likely to resist the endless tide of guilt. And the chanting itself was no small task. The psalms were long, repetitive, and recited in a monotone that blurred the line between meditation and exhaustion. If you have ever tried to stay awake during a lecture in a warm room, imagine doing so while fasting, half frozen, and forced to sing hundreds of verses in Latin. The monotony wasn't just boring, it was weaponized boredom, a way to dull the senses until desire withered away. Historical evidence shows how central this was. Some monasteries aimed to recite the entire book of Psalms, all 150 of them, every single week. Others went further, repeating key verses again and again, as if sheer repetition could hammer holiness into the skull. Modern psychologists might recognize this as a form of cognitive conditioning. The monks simply called it discipline. The sheer scale of the chanting was staggering. At Cluny Abbey, one of the most famous monastic centres in Europe, services became so elaborate they could last most of the day. One chronicler complained that the monks spent more time in choir than anywhere else, leaving little energy for manual labour. Yet the abbots defended it, arguing that singing psalms was the purest defence against sin. If the mind was always busy with prayer, the devil had no opening, and the prayers themselves often focused on exactly what the monks feared. Many psalms and hymns warned against lust, begged for purity, or described the dangers of temptation in lurid detail. The paradox was obvious. In trying to purge the thought, the chants reminded monks of it constantly. It was the medieval version of telling someone not to check their phone, ensuring that is the only thing they can think about. The act of chanting also served another purpose. It unified the community in a rhythm of sound that left little room for individuality. Your voice blended into dozens of others, your thoughts drowned by the drone of the group. There was no space for private daydreams, no pauses where imagination might creep in. It was the medieval cloisters' answer to white noise, overwhelming, relentless, and designed to fill every gap. Yet even here, the system cracked. Monks fell asleep during services, their heads bobbing mid-psalm. Some whispered, some fidgeted, some let their minds wander despite the best efforts of the abbot. Records exist of abbots punishing drowsy monks with extra fasts or even strikes for sloth. Falling asleep in prayer was not seen as natural exhaustion. It was framed as spiritual weakness, an open door for lust. What makes this even more striking is how often medieval reformers had to re-emphasize the importance of vigilance during prayer. Writings from the 12th and 13th centuries are full of warnings that monks were slipping, growing lazy, or treating chanting as routine rather than as war against desire. The very need for these reminders proves how impossible it was to live up to the standard. Humans simply cannot chant themselves pure. Still, the belief held firm. Monks were expected to treat every stray thought as a battlefield, and every psalm as a weapon. The sheer weight of the chanting became its own form of control. Even if you doubted its effect, you could not escape it. The bells rang and you obeyed. Imagine the experience. It is midnight. You're dragged from your hard bed, eyes half shut, stomach hollow. You stumble into the chapel, the cold stone underfoot, and begin the long recitation of psalms. Your lips move automatically, the Latin syllables spilling into the air like waves on a shore. Your mind drifts despite yourself. You picture warmth, comfort, softness, the forbidden things you will later confess. You snap back to the chant ashamed, only to drift again. The psalm ends, but another begins, and then another. The hours crawl forward until dawn. You file out of the chapel, more tired than when you entered, but at least with the illusion that you have fought off temptation. The truth is that prayer, for all its beauty and discipline, was less about holiness and more about control. It turned every moment of the day into surveillance, every lapse into sin, and every word into a weapon aimed at your own mind. Yet monks endured it, convinced that if they just prayed enough, thought enough, and sang enough, they could outshout their own desires. But of course, not every monk relied on chanting alone. Some turned to more extreme measures, seeking visions and mystical experiences that they believed would lift them above the body entirely. And in those visions, the line between holiness and hallucination blurred in ways that still shock historians today. The monastery did not stop at prayer and chanting. For some, the fight against desire escalated into something stranger, more intense, and at times surreal. If you could not silence the body with hunger or drown the mind with psalms, perhaps you could escape both through visions. Mysticism became the final frontier, a way to climb out of the flesh entirely, even if that climb often looked suspiciously like delirium. Mystical experiences were prized in the Middle Ages. A monk who reported visions of angels, saints, or Christ himself was treated with reverence. These encounters were believed to lift the soul above the filth of earthly life, proof that holiness could be achieved even within a body at war with itself. Yet many of these visions have a common thread. They happened during periods of extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and isolation. In other words, the very conditions most likely to cause hallucinations. Historians have noted how many mystical writings from the period describe sensations that sound less divine and more physiological. Tingling limbs, bursts of light, voices in the night. Modern medicine might diagnose them as migraines, seizures, or hypnagogic hallucinations. But in the cloister, they were evidence of God's favour. That your body was racked by weakness only made the vision seem more authentic. After all, wasn't holiness supposed to hurt? There are accounts of monks who believed they had ascended to heaven during prolonged fasting, only to collapse on the chapel floor moments later. Others wrote about being embraced by Christ in visions so intimate that later theologians debated whether they crossed into erotic territory. The language of mysticism was soaked in the vocabulary of longing. To desire God was considered safe, even holy. To desire flesh was sin. Yet the descriptions often blurred the line, leaving modern readers squinting at medieval manuscripts that sound less like devotion and more like medieval romance novels with the names changed. One striking example comes from Cistercian spirituality in the 12th century. Bernard of Clairvaux, a towering figure of the order, preached sermons on the Song of Songs, the biblical book filled with sensual imagery. He argued that the passionate language of lovers could be reinterpreted as the soul yearning for Christ. The kisses, embraces, and intoxication of love were not to be shunned, but redirected. It was in essence theological recycling. Take the fire of desire and aim it upward. The result was sermons that sound startlingly romantic for a man living in a cloister, proof of how deeply entwined spirituality and sexuality could become. But visions were not only theological, they were practical. If you could convince your superiors that you had mystical experiences, your reputation rose. You became a living example of purity and devotion. Some abbots encouraged visions as proof their community was holy. Others feared them, wary that enthusiasm could mask delusion or even heresy. The fine line between saint and lunatic was never thinner than in the cloister. The humour, if one dares call it that, lies in how predictably these visions lined up with exhaustion. You're starved, whipped, and deprived of sleep. You chant for hours until your lips feel numb. Then, in the silence of your cell, you see lights. hear voices, and feel your heart pound with warmth. You stagger to confession the next day, convinced you touched heaven. Your abbot nods, perhaps sceptical but unable to deny the sincerity in your eyes. Whether it was God or hypoglycemia, the monastery counted it as victory. Mysticism also gave monks an outlet for the desire they could not otherwise express. The longing for union with God was couched in terms that mirrored physical desire. To be consumed, embraced, filled with divine presence. Modern readers might blush at the intensity, but for monks it was safer than the alternative. Better to dream of God's embrace than risk dreaming of your fellow brother in the dormitory. The downside, of course, was that mysticism could spiral out of control. Not every vision was embraced. Some were condemned as the work of the devil, proof that the monk had opened himself to temptation rather than closed himself off. A vision deemed heretical could destroy reputations, or worse, attract the attention of inquisitors. The body may have been weak, but the stakes of imagination were dangerously high, and yet mysticism thrived. Monastic libraries filled with accounts of visions, ecstasies, and divine encounters. Some were passed down for generations as proof that holiness was possible. Others were quietly buried, too scandalous or too suspicious to survive. But the sheer volume shows how central the practice was. Mysticism was not a fringe escape. It was woven into the very fabric of monastic attempts to control desire. Imagine the scene. You're kneeling in your cold cell, lips dry from fasting, body trembling from the whip. Suddenly, you feel warmth spread through your chest. A light blooms in the darkness, and you believe you are in the presence of the divine. Your hunger disappears, your pain fades, and for a moment, you believe you have transcended the prison of your flesh. You collapse into sleep, only to wake with the same robe, the same straw, and the same guilt. The vision is gone, but the memory lingers. Was it holiness, or just the body betraying itself again? The monastery didn't care about the distinction. What mattered was the lesson. If visions gave you strength to resist desire, they were celebrated. If they led you astray, they were condemned. Either way, the cycle continued. The war against lust fought not only in the body but in the fragile, flickering light of the mind. But even visions could not fully erase the reality of temptation. The body always found ways to remind monks of what they had sworn to give up. And nothing revealed that truth more uncomfortably than the scandalous history of nocturnal emissions, the so-called wet dreams that turned beds into battlefields and forced the monastery to treat biology itself as sin. You collapse into your straw mattress, your body aching from fasting, your back sore from whipping, your lips dry from chanting psalms. The chapel is quiet, the cloister dark, the only sound the shuffling snores of your brothers lined in rows around you. You think perhaps sleep will bring relief, but in the monastery even sleep is not safe. For here, the battle against desire follows you into dreams. Nocturnal emissions, what modern science recognizes as natural biology, were treated in the Middle Ages as evidence of weakness. The very fact that your body might betray you in the night meant guilt was waiting for you at dawn. It did not matter that you were unconscious. In the cloister, unconsciousness was no excuse. The sin was catalogued, confessed, punished, and sometimes even investigated as if you had invited the devil into your bed. This obsession appears in countless medieval texts. Theologians debated whether a wet dream counted as sin if the monk's imagination had played a role. Manuals instructed confessors to ask whether the dream was accompanied by thoughts or images, as if you could control what your brain invented at midnight. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century scholastic giant, even weighed in. He argued that emissions in sleep were not sins if purely natural, but could be sinful if stirred by prior lustful thoughts. In other words, your dreams were on trial for crimes committed during the day. The absurdity of this system is hard to overstate. Imagine waking up on a straw mattress, the smell of mildew in the air, and realizing you now had to tell your superior what happened under your blanket. You shuffle to confession, eyes down, voice low, explaining that your body misbehaved while your mind was elsewhere. Your superior nods gravely, prescribes fasting or lashes, and notes your name in the mental ledger of guilt. It is the medieval equivalent of being fined because your subconscious refused to read the rulebook. The paranoia did not stop with theology. Medical writers of the Middle Ages also speculated about nocturnal emissions, often with a mix of ignorance and creativity. Some believed that diet played a role, warning that rich foods, especially meat and wine, inflamed the body and increased emissions. Others thought the problem was physical excess, recommending bloodletting or purgatives to drain the body of surplus fluids. It was the ultimate misdiagnosis. Treat hormones like plumbing and hope the leaks stop. The punishments could be harsh. A monk who confessed to frequent emissions might be assigned extra fasting, longer vigils, or even temporary exclusion from communal worship. Chronic cases were sometimes seen as evidence of deeper corruption, leading to suspicion or demotion within the order. In some monasteries, the unlucky monk could even be reassigned to humiliating tasks like cleaning latrines, as a way of both penance and deterrence. The message was clear: your dreams were your responsibility, and you would pay the price for failing to control them. And yet, despite all the guilt and punishment, nocturnal emissions were nearly universal. Medieval writers admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that even the most devout suffered them. Augustine, centuries earlier, had agonized over the question, wondering how a man could remain pure if his own sleep betrayed him. Later monks repeated the same anxiety, turning a universal biological fact into a recurring spiritual crisis. It was not a rare scandal. It was the nightly background noise of the cloister. The comedy of it all is difficult to ignore. A community of men living in constant surveillance, whispering confessions about what happened in the night, writing treatises on the mechanics of unconscious desire. It is as if the monastery ran a full-time research department dedicated to policing the dream life of its members. The fact that it never solved the problem only reinforced the belief that more rules, more guilt, and more punishment were needed. Picture the scene. The dormitory is quiet, dozens of monks sleeping side by side. In the stillness, the occasional cough, the creak of wood, the rustle of straw. But beneath it all, an unspoken fear hangs in the air. Each man knows that morning may bring not just prayer, but confession. And that confession may begin with the most dreaded phrase, "Last night, in sleep, I failed." The fascination with nocturnal emissions reveals the heart of medieval monastic anxiety. The body was not simply a vessel. It was an enemy that could not be trusted even in unconsciousness. Control was never complete. Guilt was never escaped. The war against lust did not end at bedtime. It followed you into dreams where defeat was inevitable and forgiveness became routine. But if sleep was dangerous, the monastery had another way to keep bodies in line. Rules governed not just your dreams, but your waking posture, how you sat, how you lay, even how you bathed. Because in the medieval cloister, even the smallest gestures could be interpreted as invitations to sin. You rise from your straw bed in the chill of dawn, still uneasy from the dreams you'll later have to confess, and shuffle toward the cloister. Every step you take, every movement of your robe, is not just a habit of the body, but a potential risk. In the monastery, desire could hide anywhere, even in the way you sat, the way you reclined, or the way you touched water. Posture itself became a battlefield. The rule of St. Benedict, which shaped much of Western monastic life, emphasized moderation in all things, but that moderation quickly grew into suspicion. To sit too comfortably was to court idleness, and idleness was thought to invite lust. Monks were warned against reclining too long, lying on soft surfaces, or stretching themselves in ways that might awaken the body. Even crossing your legs could draw suspicion. A relaxed pose suggested indulgence. Better to keep the body stiff, upright, and under control, even if your knees ached and your back throbbed. Bathing was another arena of suspicion. In theory, cleanliness was good. In practice, it involved nakedness, and nakedness meant danger. Medieval monastic rules varied, but many orders restricted bathing to a handful of times per year, often tied to major festivals like Easter or Christmas. The logic was that the less time spent unclothed, the fewer opportunities for temptation to strike. Monks were advised to wash only the most necessary parts, and sometimes even that with caution. One 12th century abbot warned that warm baths inflamed desire by softening the flesh, making cold water the holier choice. If you shivered, you were safe. Communal bathing, when it happened, was particularly fraught. Some monasteries banned it outright, fearing what might happen if dozens of men stripped down together in the steamy confines of a bathhouse. Others allowed it but required supervision, as if a stern gaze could keep the body from betraying itself. The result was predictable discomfort. Imagine trying to scrub straw and sweat from your skin while pretending not to notice anyone else in the room, convinced that the water itself might be charged with sin. Even gestures carried suspicion. Monks were instructed to avoid touching their own bodies unnecessarily, especially in private. Scratching an itch could be misinterpreted. Adjusting a robe could be suspect. Some confessors asked directly whether monks had touched themselves in ways that might be construed as sinful, even if the intent was nothing more than relief from lice. The paranoia was so detailed that it created its own absurdity. In trying to prevent temptation, the rules forced monks to think about temptation constantly. Historians point to records where abbots had to reprimand monks for lounging too long after meals, or lingering in dormitories when they should have been working. These were not minor breaches. They were treated as cracks in the wall of discipline, the first steps toward indulgence. The assumption was always that the body, if left unwatched, would slide toward lust like a stone rolling downhill. Only vigilance kept it upright. The irony is that many of these rules had unintended side effects. Restricting bathing meant lice, fleas, and skin diseases spread unchecked. Limiting rest meant monks often fell asleep during prayers, nodding off mid-psalm as their superiors scowled. Prohibiting comfort created bodies that were sickly, itchy, and exhausted. Yet this suffering was rebranded as holiness, proof that the monastery was succeeding in its mission to tame the flesh. The itch of lice was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a reminder that comfort was dangerous. Medical thought of the time reinforced these fears. Medieval physicians believed that heat and moisture in the body generated lust. Too much blood, too much warmth, too much relaxation, and desire would overflow. Cold, dryness, and rigidity were the cures. That is why cold water, hard benches, and stiff posture were considered spiritually safe. It was not just religious paranoia. It was bad science backing bad theology. The monk's body became a laboratory where both theories were tested, and the results were always discomfort. Picture yourself in the cloister refectory after a meagre meal of bread and broth. You shift on the wooden bench, your spine aching, and immediately think better of it. Too much movement could be seen as indulgent. Later, in the dormitory, you roll onto your side to ease the pain in your hip, only to remember that lying too comfortably might invite suspicion. Even the act of finding a better position on a straw mattress becomes a moral calculation. There is no rest from surveillance, not even from yourself. And when the rare chance to bathe comes, the experience is less relief than ordeal. The water is cold, the air damp, the other monk standing nearby in silence. You dip quickly, shiver, and scramble to cover yourself with a robe that smells faintly of mould. The clean skin is welcome, but the rules have already stolen the joy. You're left with nothing but goosebumps and the quiet fear that even this necessity might become evidence against you. What emerges from all of this is a world where the body was never neutral. Every gesture, every position, every wash of the skin was loaded with moral weight. Monks were not just policing thoughts, they were policing posture. The human frame itself was treated like a suspect, always on the verge of confession. And the result was an environment where even scratching a flea bite could feel like spiritual failure. Yet for all their efforts, monks could not escape the fact that the human body is not easily tamed. The lice still bit, the skin still sweated, the joints still ached, and beneath the rules and rituals desire still lingered. which is why monasteries eventually turned to another extreme tactic, separating men from women so completely that even the faintest reminder of the opposite sex could be eliminated from daily life. The monastery's obsession with controlling desire did not stop at the edges of your own body. It extended outward, beyond the cloister walls to the very presence of women. For medieval monks, women were not simply neighbours or fellow Christians. They were hazards, embodiments of temptation, and often described in terms that sound less like theology and more like medieval horror stories. Strict rules governed contact. Many monasteries banned women entirely from entering the cloister. Some even forbade them from walking too close to the walls, in case their presence distracted the monks inside. Visitors were restricted, conversations limited, and even the sight of a woman was treated as spiritually dangerous. Monastic statutes warned against familiarity with the female sex, as if a smile exchanged across a courtyard might ignite a bonfire of lust that centuries of chanting could not extinguish. Historical records show how deep this paranoia went. At Cluny, one of the great Benedictine monasteries, women were strictly forbidden from entering the main cloister, even if they were relatives of monks. The Cistercians were harsher still, barring women from their churches and burying grounds. There are stories of abbots ordering walls rebuilt because they feared women might be seen from the choir stalls. To us it may sound absurd, but to them, the sight of a woman was not just distraction. It was a crack in the fortress of chastity. The language used to describe women in monastic texts makes the anxiety obvious. They were called snares, traps, even instruments of the devil. Sermons warned that women's bodies were lures designed to drag holy men into sin. Their hair was likened to nets, their voices to poison, their touch to chains. It was less a description of women as people and more a catalogue of hazards, like a medieval health manual warning against spoiled meat. And yet the sheer intensity of the warnings reveals what lay beneath, a deep, unshakable fear of desire that could not be silenced by walls. The irony is that monasteries depended on women in countless ways. Women worked as servants, tended lands belonging to monastic estates, and even managed finances in some cases. Nuns in female monasteries shared similar vows, yet relations between male and female houses were often fraught with suspicion. Monks who dealt with nuns were reminded constantly to guard their eyes, their words, their thoughts. A letter from the 12th century warned monks not to be too helpful when visiting convents, as if generosity itself might slip into sin. And yet, despite all the walls and warnings, scandal still erupted. Records survive of abbots caught in relationships with noblewomen, monks sneaking out to meet women in nearby villages, and entire communities rocked by rumours of affairs. The more the rules tightened, the more shocking the breaches became. One chronicle describes a monk discovered with a woman hidden in the monastery itself, a scandal that led to public disgrace and punishment. The very fear of women created a kind of magnetic pull, turning every breach into spectacle. It is tempting to laugh at the paranoia, but it reveals something essential about medieval monastic thought. Desire was not just inside you, it was externalized, embodied in women, treated as an invading force. If your own body was treacherous, then women were seen as accomplices in the betrayal. By demonizing women, the monastery tried to shift blame outward, even as it reinforced the endless cycle of guilt. Medical theories of the time added fuel to the fire. Some physicians claimed that women's bodies emitted vapours that inflamed men's lust. Others argued that women's very presence could stir men's humours into imbalance. The result was a pseudoscience of avoidance. Better to keep women at a distance to treat them as contagious hazards than risk a flare-up of desire that no amount of fasting could cure. Picture yourself walking through the cloister garden, the sound of bees in the herbs, the smell of damp earth in the air. A visitor approaches, a woman asking to speak with the abbot about a land dispute. You keep your eyes down, your pace steady, your robe tight. You're not allowed to greet her warmly, not allowed to look too long, not allowed to risk even a moment of familiarity. She passes, and you feel both relief and shame. Relief that you obeyed, shame that your heart raced anyway. This tension defined monastic life. Women were at once feared and necessary, demonized and unavoidable. Their exclusion created a world where monks lived in a bubble of male-only existence, but their constant mention in sermons and rules shows how impossible it was to erase them from the imagination. The monastery may have built high walls, but desire leapt over them in memory, fantasy, and fear. The absurdity lies in the fact that these measures often backfired. By focusing so intensely on the dangers of women, the cloister kept the idea of women alive in the minds of monks. Sermons warning against hair as a net made monks think about hair. Rules banning conversations made monks hyper-aware of conversations. The attempt to erase women only etched them deeper into consciousness, turning absence itself into presence. And so, day after day, monks lived in a world where the female body was never seen but always imagined. A shadow that haunted the cloister, more powerful in its absence than in its presence. The war against lust had created a paradox. By trying to eliminate temptation, the monastery had made temptation inescapable. But the monastery's war did not stop at women. It also extended to how monks interacted with their own brothers. Suspicion reached into friendships, laughter, even the way you shared food. Because desire was not only feared between sexes, it was policed within the cloister itself, where bonds between men could be seen as just as dangerous. You return from the cloister walk, the memory of the forbidden presence of women still lingering like a shadow, and step back into the world of your brothers. Here you would think things are safer, less fraught, more familiar. Yet in the monastery, even friendship was viewed with suspicion. Bonds between men, the kind of companionship that makes hard days easier, were treated as potential gateways to temptation. The monastery did not only fear women, it feared intimacy of any kind. The concern was known as particular friendships. Monastic rules warned against growing too close to a single brother. You were expected to show equal affection to all, never preferring one person above the rest. To eat with the same companion too often, to sit together during prayers, or to share small jokes was considered dangerous. In some orders, even being seen together repeatedly was enough to draw rebuke. The idea was simple. Strong bonds created loyalty. Loyalty could create secrecy, and secrecy could lead to sin. Historical documents reveal just how seriously this was taken. The Cistercian order, famous for its austerity, forbade monks from sharing beds, speaking privately for long periods, or displaying obvious affection. Benedictine communities issued warnings against excessive familiarity. Even laughter was viewed with suspicion. Smiles were allowed, but loud, prolonged laughter was condemned in many rules as a distraction from holiness and a sign that intimacy was drifting too far. You could smile politely. You could not giggle with your best friend like a pair of schoolboys in class. The suspicion did not stop there. Meals were eaten in silence, with readings from scripture or saintly texts filling the air instead of conversation. Talking while eating was considered not only impolite but spiritually risky. Sharing food could be seen as an expression of favoritism, so if you attempted to slip a friend an extra slice of bread, it might be interpreted as something more. Your appetite for companionship was treated with the same caution as your appetite for flesh, and yet the very need for these rules reveals how common close bonds must have been. Living together day and night, sharing chores, prayers and suffering, monks naturally formed attachments. Records survive of abbots complaining about secret pairs who were always found together, walking side by side in the cloister or whispering after prayers. Punishments included separation, public rebuke, or being assigned to different tasks. In some cases, friendships deemed too strong were broken up like dangerous romances. This constant suspicion seeped into the culture of the monastery. A gesture of kindness could be misinterpreted. A long conversation could be frowned upon. The result was an atmosphere where warmth itself was rationed, parcelled out carefully so as not to cross invisible lines. It was not enough to control lust. The monastery aimed to control affection. The irony, of course, is that monks often referred to each other as brothers. The language of family was everywhere, but the rules undermined it. You were encouraged to see everyone as a sibling in Christ, but not allowed to actually love any one person too much. The attempt to flatten relationships into a single level of detached charity created a world where intimacy was feared, even as community was demanded. Historical anecdotes underline the absurdity. There are accounts of monks who were disciplined for walking side by side too often, as if synchronized footsteps hinted at synchronized hearts. One 13th century abbot warned that even sitting too close on a bench could lead to corruption of morals. It is hard not to picture rows of monks deliberately spacing themselves apart like awkward strangers on a crowded bus. The paranoia about nearness reveals how fragile the ideal of chastity truly was. Even laughter carried danger. The rule of St. Benedict advised against loud or boisterous laughter, framing it as a crack in the wall of discipline. Later writers connected laughter to intimacy, suggesting that shared jokes were a step toward inappropriate closeness. In practice, this meant that joy itself was sometimes treated as suspect. A world without laughter may have been holy, but it was hardly human. The restrictions extended to gestures of comfort. Placing a hand on a brother's shoulder, embracing during sorrow, or leaning too close during conversation were all discouraged. Some monasteries banned such gestures outright, fearing that compassion could turn into something else. The result was a culture where emotional expression was policed as thoroughly as physical desire. If you suffered quietly. If you rejoiced carefully. Human warmth was regulated down to the smallest touch. But as always, human nature found cracks in the rules. Letters survive between monks expressing affection in words that sound remarkably tender. Chronicles tell of brothers who resisted separation, who struggled when punished for growing too close. Some scandals broke into the open, revealing that forbidden friendships had turned into exactly the kind of intimacy the rules feared. Others remained hidden, known only to those within the cloister, whispered about in the very silence meant to prevent them. The paradox is clear. By trying to suppress friendship, the monastery highlighted its importance. The very effort to control closeness revealed how much monks longed for it. In a world of silence, fasting, and punishment, companionship was not a luxury. It was survival. The monastery tried to strip it away, but affection persisted in letters, glances, and stolen moments. Picture yourself in the cloister refectory. The air smells faintly of cabbage and candle smoke. You shift on the hard bench, careful not to lean too close to the monk beside you. You want to whisper a joke about the watery broth, but you bite it back, knowing silence is demanded. Across the room, you see two monks laughing quietly, only to be silenced with a sharp look from the abbot. The room falls still again, joy smothered under discipline. You realize then that even laughter is rationed, measured, and suspicious. In the end, the monastery's war on particular friendship shows the depth of its anxiety about desire. Lust was not just a problem between men and women. It was seen as lurking in every bond, every smile, every shared moment of joy. By treating intimacy as a danger, the monastery created a culture where suspicion and guilt ruled over affection. But the monastery's paranoia reached even further. It was not only relationships, gestures, or dreams that were policed. Even the way monks slept was regulated, down to the arrangement of beds and the rules about how you lay under your blanket. Because in the war against desire, the dormitory itself became a battlefield. You file into the dormitory, the great communal sleeping hall of the monastery. The air is heavy with damp straw, stale wool, and the faint but unmistakable odour of too many bodies crammed together. Dozens of beds line the walls, simple wooden frames or straw pallets, each occupied by a monk wrapped tightly in a robe. Privacy does not exist here. That is the point. Sleep itself was regulated with military precision, because even the hours of darkness were believed to be fertile ground for sin. The rule of St. Benedict mandated communal dormitories. Unlike the aristocracy, who prized private chambers, monks were to sleep in a single hall under the watchful eye of the abbot or senior brothers. Curtains were forbidden. Partitions were rare. The idea was transparency. If everyone slept in sight of everyone else, no one could indulge in secret behaviours. The dormitory was less a bedroom and more a surveillance system, a living panopticon centuries before the word was invented. The arrangement of the beds was deliberate. Monks often lay with their heads uncovered and their robes tied tightly at the waist to prevent wandering hands. They were instructed to sleep lightly, ready to rise for the midnight office at the toll of the bell. Beds were placed side by side, often so close that turning in the night might brush against your neighbour. Yet touching was forbidden, which meant you were both surrounded and alone. It was intimacy without affection, enforced by architecture. Historical records reveal just how seriously this was enforced. The Cistercians, known for their strictness, required monks to sleep in tunics and belts, even in sweltering summers. The logic was that modesty must never be dropped, not even in unconsciousness. One account describes how novices were warned to keep their blankets tight, as exposing even a leg could be considered scandalous. Imagine the absurdity of men sweating in heavy wool in July, convinced that bare skin was an open invitation to sin. The rules extended to posture. Monks were encouraged to lie on their backs or sides in ways deemed chaste, never in positions that might stimulate the body. Lying face down, for example, was frowned upon because it pressed the body too close to the mattress. Curling up was sometimes discouraged as well, since it was associated with comfort, and comfort was dangerous. In effect, monks were policed even in the unconscious geometry of their sleep, and the surveillance did not stop when the candles went out. Senior monks sometimes patrolled dormitories at night, making sure the community slept as it should. Chronicles record abbots sneaking through the rows of beds to ensure no one was indulging in private sins. The mere act of tossing and turning could draw attention. If you shifted too much, you risked suspicion. If you lay too still, you risked suspicion. Sleep became not a release but a performance, another ritual to be executed correctly. The paranoia reached absurd heights. Some orders required monks to rise at intervals during the night to pray, breaking up sleep deliberately. The stated reason was devotion. The unstated reason was that fragmented sleep left little room for dreaming. Less dreaming meant fewer chances for the dreaded nocturnal emissions, fewer fantasies, fewer failures of the flesh. The architecture of time itself was turned into a weapon against desire. The irony is that these rules often produced the opposite of their intention. Sleep deprivation weakened bodies, made minds wander, and left monks less able to resist temptation during waking hours. Fatigue became its own form of indulgence, as monks nodded off during services or dozed in the cloister garden. Punishments for drowsiness only added to the cycle, as tired men were forced into longer vigils, ensuring they would be even more exhausted the next day. One of the most striking aspects is how medieval observers recorded these struggles. There are accounts of monks snoring loudly, disrupting prayers, or being reprimanded for rolling over onto their stomachs. Visitors sometimes mocked monastic dormitories for smelling like barns, the air thick with sweat, straw, and humanity. Yet inside, the monks believed this arrangement was holy. To sleep in isolation would invite privacy. To sleep together, even miserably, was to build a fortress against lust. Imagine lying on your straw mattress, the itch of lice crawling along your scalp, the scratch of wool against your skin, the steady chorus of snores filling the air. You keep your hands visible, your robe tied, your body arranged just so, because even in the dark you feel the weight of invisible eyes. You drift into shallow sleep, only to be jolted awake by the midnight bell, dragged to the chapel for another round of chanting before collapsing again onto your pallet. You repeat this night after night, the cycle of exhaustion and surveillance grinding down both body and spirit. And yet, despite all these measures, scandal still broke out. Chronicles speak of monks caught in beds together, or of novices reprimanded for wandering at night. The communal dormitory, meant to prevent sin, often became the very stage for it. The presence of so many men in close quarters created both opportunity and temptation, no matter how tightly the rules tried to suppress it. The architecture of chastity could not erase human desire. It only contained it within walls that echoed with whispers. The dormitory tells us much about the logic of medieval monasticism. The body was never trusted, not even in its most vulnerable state. Sleep, which should have been a refuge, became another battlefield, another chance for guilt, another reason to confess. By turning rest into performance and intimacy into suspicion, the monastery transformed even dreams into crimes. But the war against desire was not limited to where you slept. It also shaped how you worked. For in the monastery, even labour was designed to keep lust at bay, turning ploughs, hammers and looms into weapons against temptation. You rise from your restless night in the communal dormitory, eyelids heavy from interrupted sleep, and shuffle toward the day's labour. The monastery believed that work was not just about survival, it was about salvation. Manual labour was one of the most important tools to combat lust, because an idle body was seen as a dangerous one. The saying was simple: if your hands were busy, they could not wander. The rule of St. Benedict explicitly demanded that monks balance prayer with work. Ora et labora, pray and work. This was not just about producing food or maintaining buildings, it was about discipline. A monk who tilled the soil until his back ached was too tired to indulge in sin. Sweat was not only a sign of labour, but of purity. The more you worked, the less energy you had left for desire. Gardening was a common task. Monks bent over long rows of herbs and vegetables, hands caked with dirt, faces burned by the sun. The monastery diet depended heavily on gardens, so these tasks were essential, but abbots also praised them for their spiritual benefits. The repetitive rhythm of weeding and digging was said to quiet the mind, forcing it away from wandering thoughts. One abbot wrote that the hoe and the spade were as useful for chastity as prayer itself. You did not simply weed the earth, you weeded the soul. Other forms of labour were just as carefully chosen. Copying manuscripts was not only about preserving knowledge, it was about keeping monks occupied for hours, heads bent over parchment, eyes straining in the dim light. The task was exhausting and monotonous, but that was exactly the point. Tedium was a form of discipline. If you were too bored and too tired to think of anything else, you were winning the battle against lust. Historians note that scriptoria, the rooms where monks copied texts, were designed to be quiet, cold, and physically demanding. The act of writing became an ascetic practice. Even the cramps in your hand were framed as victories against temptation. Heavy labour had its place too. Monks chopped wood, hauled water, built walls and repaired roofs. Each task was presented not only as practical but as holy. Sweating under the weight of a beam was a prayer in action. Carrying buckets of water was a way of carrying the cross. The physical exhaustion left little time or energy for the body's urges. In effect, the monastery treated hard labour like an antidote to hormones. The obsession with labour shows up in the punishments as well. A monk who confessed to impure thoughts might be assigned extra hours in the fields or kitchens. If the sin was more serious, he might be given the dirtiest jobs. Cleaning latrines, mucking out pigsties, or hauling manure were all considered proper penance. It was not only humiliation, it was thought to purify the flesh by breaking it down, forcing the body into obedience through filth and sweat. But the irony, as always, was that the system often backfired. Exhaustion could produce strange effects of its own. Monks worn down by endless hours of work sometimes collapsed during prayers, their bodies too weak to follow the rhythm of devotion. Hunger combined with physical strain could lead to fainting spells, hallucinations, or illness. Instead of eliminating desire, the constant fatigue sometimes made monks more aware of their bodies, more prone to distraction. The very system designed to control lust often heightened it by making the body impossible to ignore. Historical evidence underscores this tension. Some abbots warned against overwork, pointing out that monks were collapsing under the strain. Others doubled down, convinced that more labour meant more holiness. The result was a patchwork of approaches. Some monasteries became centres of learning, with monks spending long hours in scriptoria. Others emphasised agricultural work, turning the cloister into a kind of spiritual farm. But the logic was always the same. Keep the body moving, keep the mind occupied, leave no room for temptation to creep in. Imagine yourself bent over in the fields, sweat dripping into your eyes, hands raw from the hoe. You straighten for a moment, stretching your back, only to feel the eyes of the abbot watching. Rest is dangerous. Rest invites thoughts. You force yourself back into the rhythm, pulling weeds with mechanical precision. Each root you tear a symbolic victory over desire. Later, in the scriptorium, you scratch words onto parchment until your fingers cramp and your neck stiffens. You glance at the line you just copied, realize it makes little sense, but press on. The meaning does not matter. The act of writing is the prayer. The act of fatigue is the chastity. The monastery turned every tool into a weapon. The plough, the pen, the hammer, the loom. None were neutral. All were harnessed to keep the body in check. The paradox was that monks often became some of the most productive workers of the medieval world, precisely because their abbots were trying to control desire. Monastic estates grew into massive landholders, monasteries became centres of agriculture and learning, all because lust was feared more than laziness. Chastity fueled an empire of labour. Yet even this empire could not erase the problem. Desire still crept in. Monks still confessed. Scandal still erupted. The monastery could fill every hour of the day with work, but the human body carried its own clock, ticking quietly beneath the noise of labour. The war could be delayed, distracted, exhausted, but never won. And when labour failed, the monastery turned to another weapon. Not work, not prayer, not punishment, but the reshaping of time itself. Through strict schedules, bells, and endless cycles of repetition, the cloister tried to control not just what you did, but when you did it. Because if lust could not be beaten by labour, perhaps it could be outmanoeuvred by time. The bell rings, sharp and unrelenting, echoing across the cloister walls. It pulls you from your pallet, from your half-finished dream, from the tiny fragment of peace your body tried to salvage. This is how monks lived every day, not by their own rhythms, but by the sound of bells that carved time into pieces. The monastery was not just a place of prayer. It was a machine of hours, a relentless cycle where the schedule itself became a tool to fight desire. The rule of St. Benedict laid the foundation. Time was divided into canonical hours, each marked by prayer, labour or reading. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime after sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline at night. Together these created a system where monks were never far from obligation. If lust needed leisure to grow, then leisure would be eradicated. Bells became the walls of an invisible prison, ringing before desire had time to stir. The midnight service was perhaps the most brutal. Monks were pulled from sleep to chant psalms in the dark, their bodies groggy, their minds hazy. It was devotion, but also strategy. Interrupted sleep was believed to weaken the flesh, leaving no strength for temptation. Chroniclers describe monks stumbling through prayers half awake, some nodding off mid-verse, only to be roused by the cold stone floor or the stern gaze of a superior. Sleep deprivation was holiness. Exhaustion was a form of chastity. The repetition of the hours created a rhythm that erased individuality. Your day was not your own. You did not decide when to rise, when to eat, when to rest. Every action was scheduled. This was more than discipline. It was psychological warfare against desire. The bell replaced instinct. The calendar replaced longing. Desire requires gaps, spaces, unstructured time. The monastery made sure no such gaps existed. Historical evidence shows how far this obsession went. At Cluny Abbey, the offices were so elaborate that they consumed nearly the entire day. The monks prayed, sang, and processed so frequently that some outsiders accused them of neglecting manual labour. But the abbots defended the practice fiercely. Time filled with prayer was time stolen from sin. Even if monks were exhausted, even if their fields suffered, the priority was chastity. The Cistercians took a different approach. Their days were stricter in simplicity, balancing prayer with work, but their schedules were no less relentless. Bells tolled at precise intervals, breaking up the day into fragments too small for indulgence. Meals were timed, readings assigned, rest carefully rationed. The Cistercians prided themselves on austerity, and their control of time reflected it. They built days like walls, impenetrable and narrow. Even the technology of timekeeping reflected this war. Monasteries became centres of clockmaking in medieval Europe, not because monks were obsessed with punctuality for its own sake, but because precision was spiritual. A bell rung at the wrong hour could mean a gap in devotion, a moment for temptation to creep in. Time itself became sacred, measured, catalogued, defended. Some historians argue that our modern obsession with clocks and schedules has its roots in this monastic paranoia. The very idea of the workday, divided by hours, was born from the fear of lust. The humour lies in the relentlessness of it all. Imagine being dragged from bed at midnight, chanting psalms until dawn, only to be sent to the fields, then back to the chapel, then to the scriptorium, then to another service. Your body is screaming for rest, but the bell rings again. There is no escape, no unstructured hour, no chance for daydreams. It is like living in an endless school timetable, where the teacher never leaves the room, and the punishment for misbehaviour is eternal. The punishments for disobedience to the schedule were severe. Sleeping through bells could mean fasting, scourging, or being forced to pray extra psalms. Chronic tardiness could damage your reputation for holiness. Some abbots were known to patrol the dormitory at night, ensuring that no one lingered in bed after the bell. Others assigned watchmen to ensure monks filed into the chapel on time. You were never beyond the reach of the clock. Yet for all its strictness, the system had unintended side effects. The constant breaking up of time left monks physically drained. Hunger and exhaustion piled on, leaving men hollow-eyed and weak. Some confessed that they could not focus during prayers, their minds wandering to food, warmth, or forbidden thoughts. The very system designed to erase temptation sometimes heightened it by reminding monks of what they were missing. Lust did not disappear. It was simply chased in circles around the clock, never allowed to rest but never eliminated. Picture yourself in the cloister at noon, the sun bright in the sky. When the bell rings again, you set down your tools, wipe sweat from your brow, and march back to the chapel. You kneel, chant, bow, and rise, your body aching. The service ends, and you file back to the fields. Moments later, another bell calls you to the refectory, where you eat thin broth in silence. Then back to work, then back to prayer, then to the dormitory, then up again at midnight. The hours blur together, each the same, each relentless. Time itself becomes a whip, lashing you forward. The monastery's schedule shows the depth of its obsession. Desire was not only pleased in action or thought, it was pleased in the very structure of life. By slicing the day into countless fragments, monks believed they could starve lust of oxygen, keep it gasping, never give it room to breathe. And yet, the records of confessions and scandals show that even this was not enough. Bells could ring every hour, prayers could fill every silence, but desire remained stubborn, a flame that flickered even in the most carefully constructed cage. And when time failed, the monastery turned to another battlefield entirely. Not labour, not prayer, not schedules, but the human body itself as a symbol. For in the cloister, even clothing and grooming were weaponized, turning robes, tonsures, and the very absence of beauty into tools against temptation. You shuffle back from yet another round of prayer, the bell still echoing in your ears, and feel the heavy wool of your robe dragging against your skin. The garment is plain, coarse, and shapeless, and that is exactly how it was meant to be. In the monastery, even clothing was drafted into the war against lust. Robes, haircuts, and the deliberate stripping away of beauty were not just customs, they were strategies. The monastic robe was designed to erase the body. Where the nobleman flaunted velvet, fur, and bright colours, the monk wrapped himself in dull wool, often undyed, rough against the skin. The Benedictine habit was black, the Cistercian white, but both were equally plain. No tailoring, no decoration, no ornament. The fabric was scratchy, heavy, and never flattering. Its purpose was not comfort or style. Its purpose was to smother the body, to erase any trace of vanity, to remind you at every moment that desire was not welcome here. The discomfort was part of the logic. Sources note that some orders insisted on coarse cloth, precisely because it chafed and irritated the skin. Pain, however small, was thought to guard against pleasure. If your robe rubbed your shoulders raw, you would be too busy scratching to entertain lustful thoughts. It was the medieval equivalent of installing barbed wire around your own body. Hair was treated the same way. Monks wore the tonsure, a shaved crown surrounded by a fringe of hair. To modern eyes, it looks absurd. To medieval monks, it was a symbol of humility and obedience. But it also stripped away vanity. No one could look handsome with a bald circle carved into their scalp. That was the point. It made the monk visibly set apart, undesirable in worldly terms, a walking renunciation of beauty. Some critics mocked the tonsure as ridiculous, and even in its own time it was controversial. But within the cloister, it was both a badge of honour and a safeguard. If desire begins with attraction, then attraction itself must be destroyed. Beards, jewellery, perfumes, and fashionable shoes were all forbidden. Grooming was pared down to the bare minimum. Monks were warned not to look in mirrors too often, lest vanity creep in. Even washing could be policed, since too much cleanliness suggested pride. Better to stink in humility than to smell sweet in temptation. Records describe abbots scolding monks for trimming their hair too neatly, or for adjusting their robes with too much care. Holiness meant ugliness, and ugliness was safety. Historical sources reveal how far this went. In the 12th century, the Cistercians were famous for their austerity, rejecting all decoration in clothing and architecture. They banned bright colours, embroidery, and even unnecessary folds in garments. Everything had to be plain, sharp, and unadorned. The logic was not only spiritual, it was psychological. By stripping away beauty, they stripped away the risk of desire. The cloister became a world drained of colour, where everything was grey, white, or black, a kind of medieval greyscale filter imposed on life. Yet, as always, cracks appeared. Some monks secretly longed for finer garments, smuggling in softer cloth, or repairing robes with more care than allowed. Others complained that the coarse habits caused sores, rashes, and infestations of lice. Visitors sometimes mocked monks for their shabby appearance, comparing them unfavourably to peasants. The war against beauty came at the cost of dignity, leaving monks trapped in garments that protected them from temptation, but also made them miserable. The humour emerges in the details. Imagine a monk adjusting his robe, trying to make the scratchy fabric sit more comfortably, only to realise that even the act of fussing with clothing could be considered vanity. Imagine the tonsured head, bald circle shining in the candlelight, itching from lice that nested in the fringe of hair left behind. The very symbols of chastity became magnets for discomfort, and the discomfort was treated not as failure but as victory. If you were ugly and itchy, you were on the right path. The tonsure itself carried strange symbolism. Some said it represented the crown of thorns, others humility, others a mark of separation from the world. But one of its unspoken functions was deterrence. No woman, the logic went, would be tempted by a man with a shaved bald spot and shapeless robe. Whether that was true or not, the intention was clear. Beauty was a threat. Attraction was a doorway. better to slam the door by shaving it off. The irony, of course, is that repression often heightened fascination. By making beauty forbidden, the monastery made it more powerful. Monks wrote sermons against vanity, warning about the dangers of perfume, jewellery and long hair, but in doing so they described them in detail. The forbidden was never forgotten. Even in the act of renouncing beauty, the imagination kept it alive. Picture yourself kneeling in the chapel, the wool of your robe itching against your skin, your tonsured scalp stinging from the cold. Around you are dozens of men dressed identically, heads shaved, garments plain. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed wool and sweat. There is no colour, no softness, no ornament. You are part of a sea of sameness, a world stripped bare of beauty. It is meant to free you from temptation, but instead it reminds you, day after day, of everything that has been taken away. And so the war against lust marched on, now fought not only in confessionals and gardens or in dormitories, but in the very fabric that touched your skin and the hair on your head. The body was made to be uncomfortable, unattractive and forgettable. Beauty was sacrificed at the altar of chastity. But even this was not enough. For if monks could not be trusted with beauty, and if plain robes and shaved heads could not kill desire, then another weapon had to be sharpened. That weapon was fear. And few things inspired fear in a medieval monastery like the threat of hellfire, eternal damnation, and the grotesque punishments described in sermons meant to terrify lust right out of the body. You kneel in the chapel, your scalp raw from the tonsure, your robe itching against your skin, and listen as the abbot climbs the pulpit. His voice rises in the dim candlelight, not soft, not soothing, but sharp with warning. This is another weapon in the monastery's arsenal. Not fasting, not labour, not chanting, but fear. Fear of sin, fear of flesh, fear of what awaited after death if lust was not crushed into submission. Medieval sermons did not mince words. Preachers described hell in grotesque detail, drawing on scripture, apocrypha, and centuries of imagination. The lustful, they said, would be tormented by fire, devils, and endless shame. Their bodies, which had betrayed them in life, would be mutilated for eternity. One popular image was of sinners burning in flames while demons mocked them, reminding them of the pleasures they had sought. The point was not subtle. If desire seemed sweet in the moment, it would become unbearable in eternity. Monks were the constant audience for these warnings. If ordinary peasants heard such sermons occasionally, monks lived under them daily. The abbot's words echoed the texts they copied, the psalms they chanted, the stories they read. Everywhere they turned, the message was the same. Lust was not only sin, it was damnation. One slip, one thought, one dream left unconfessed could weigh against you at judgment. The paranoia was total. Theologians fed this atmosphere. Peter Damian, an 11th century reformer, wrote ferociously against sexual sin in monasteries, condemning everything from impure thoughts to sodomy in lurid detail. His treatise, the Liber Gomorianus, described monasteries as plagued by secret vice, accusing monks of living double lives of prayer by day and sin by night. His language was vivid, his warnings terrifying, and his solution uncompromising. Severe punishments, lifelong penance, even exclusion from the sacraments. For Damien and others like him, lust was not a small failing. It was the rot that could destroy the entire church. The medieval imagination was particularly fond of bodily punishments in hell. Lustful sinners were described as being bound in chains, scorched by fire, gnawed by worms, or submerged in rivers of filth. Illustrations in manuscripts showed demons dragging naked figures into cauldrons or whipping them with iron cords. The imagery was not random. It deliberately mirrored the body, reminding monks that the flesh they struggled against in life would become their tormentor in death. If your body had betrayed you in the dormitory, it would betray you again in hell. Even dreams were used against you. preachers warned that the devil planted impure visions at night, hoping to ensnare the soul. The nocturnal emission, already a source of shame, became a terrifying reminder of your vulnerability. Sleep was not refuge. It was a battlefield where your soul could lose without you even knowing. Fear was the only alarm clock that never stopped ringing. What makes this even more striking is how personalised the sermons could be. Abbots sometimes tailored warnings to specific behaviours observed in their cloisters. If monks were caught laughing too much, the sermon would condemn merriment as a gateway to lust. If monks slouched in their stalls, the sermon would thunder against laziness as the devil's tool. The effect was suffocating. Every act, every movement, every stray thought could become the subject of fiery rhetoric. The humour in hindsight is the sheer excess of it. Imagine listening to a sermon where the abbot describes, in lurid detail, the eternal tortures reserved for those who dared to think a lustful thought. You nod solemnly, terrified, but also now vividly imagining the very sins you were told to avoid. The medieval church was engaged in the longest reverse psychology experiment in history. By trying to scare monks away from lust, it ensured that lust was never far from their minds. Fear extended beyond sermons into art and architecture. Monasteries were decorated with frescoes of the Last Judgment, showing naked sinners dragged into hell. Manuscripts copied by monks often included illustrations of devils tormenting the lustful. Even carvings in cloisters sometimes depicted grotesque figures, contorted bodies, leering demons, meant to remind viewers of the dangers of desire. The cloister was not only filled with prayer and silence, it was filled with fear carved into stone and painted on walls. Picture yourself staring at a mural of the damned as the abbot's voice booms overhead. You see figures with twisted faces, flames licking their bodies, demons gnashing their teeth. The candlelight flickers across the paint, making the figures seem alive. You shiver, not only from the cold stone beneath you, but from the weight of the message. Your body is a liability, your thoughts a trap, your desires a path straight into fire. You bow your head, whispering prayers, desperate to believe that fasting and flagellation will keep you safe. Yet, for all the fire and brimstone, scandal still surfaced. Monks still confessed, still slipped, still failed. The threat of hell was powerful, but not enough to erase biology. The monastery doubled down with more rules, more sermons, more punishments, as if piling fear upon fear could finally smother desire. But desire persisted, stubborn and unyielding, mocking the very sermons meant to destroy it. And when fear of hell was not enough, the monastery turned to another tool. Not sermons, not art, but the ultimate weapon of institutional control, public shame. For in the cloister, your private failings could be dragged into the open, displayed before your brothers, and paraded as lessons in humiliation. You might think that in the silence of the cloister your sins would remain private, whispered quietly in the confessional, sealed between monk and abbot. But the monastery had no interest in keeping lust discreet. Instead, it paraded it in front of everyone. When a monk slipped, the sin became spectacle, turned into a ritual of humiliation designed to terrify others into obedience. The walls that muffled laughter and muffled desire echoed loudly with shame. Public penance was one of the church's favourite tools. If a monk was caught in an act of impurity, or even admitted to one, he could be forced into the centre of the chapter house wearing a coarse garment, barefoot, and sometimes holding a candle as if to expose his own darkness. He might be ordered to lie flat on the cold stone floor while his brothers stepped over him, a living doormat for their sandals. The idea was simple. Let one man's humiliation serve as a reminder that no one was above discipline, and that the body was always watching for an excuse to betray the soul. Historical records describe some punishments with almost comedic cruelty. A monk guilty of touching himself could be sentenced to eat meals lying on the ground like an animal. Others were forced to kneel in the refectory while the rest of the brothers ate, their heads bowed, their plates empty, their hunger gnawing as loudly as their shame. In some cases, monks were made to stand outside in the cold, wearing nothing but a thin tunic while chanting psalms, their teeth chattering as a visible warning. In theory, this was about repentance. In practice, it was about fear. The rule of St. Benedict, the backbone of medieval monastic life, actually encouraged these spectacles. It instructed abbots to handle discipline with both severity and mercy, which often translated into very creative humiliations. The guilty monk could be isolated, excluded from communal prayer, or made to perform humiliating tasks. Sometimes he was sent to clean the latrines, a task already dreaded in monastic life. To sin in lust was to be reduced literally to scraping filth. You might chant psalms by day, but one slip of the flesh meant handling buckets of excrement by night. Humiliation was not only punishment but prevention. By seeing their brothers publicly shamed, monks were reminded of their own frailty. Fear of hell was distant, abstract, but fear of being laughed at by the very men you prayed beside was immediate. A whispered confession in the dark booth was tolerable. Having to strip down and beg forgiveness on the cold chapel floor was a deterrent few wanted to test. The monastery weaponized embarrassment with the efficiency of a military campaign. And it was not only sexual sins that earned such treatment. Even laughter could bring discipline, since laughter was linked to frivolity, and frivolity to lust. A monk who giggled too much could be punished as though he had strayed into impure thoughts. The logic was absurd but effective. Monks became watchful not only of their own bodies but of their smiles, careful that even joy did not betray them. Imagine living in a place where laughing at the wrong moment could put you on the floor of the chapter house with ashes on your head. There were more extreme examples as well. Some penitential manuals describe punishments that sound more like theatre than discipline. A monk might be forced to wear chains under his robe as a constant reminder of sin. Others were commanded to stand in the refectory with their food spiked with ashes or bitter herbs, so that every bite was a lesson in disgust. There are records of monks being required to crawl on their knees in front of their brothers, chanting penitential psalms while their robes dragged through the dirt. Each ritual was meant to rewrite the body's memory. Desire might once have brought pleasure, but now it would bring only shame. The irony, of course, is that these punishments often drew more attention to the very sins they tried to suppress. If a monk was humiliated in public, everyone instantly knew what he had done. The monastery became a stage, and sin became the script. Instead of erasing lust, public penance made it visible, unforgettable, a story whispered in the dormitories long after the candles went out. The attempt to crush desire created a spectacle that kept it alive. Punishments could also vary depending on status. A young novice might be treated more harshly to scare him straight, while an older monk might receive a gentler penance to preserve dignity. But the underlying message was the same. No one was immune. The abbot might not be forced to clean latrines, but even he lived under the same shadow of fear. Discipline was communal. It was the shared weapon that kept everyone in line, whether by threat or by memory. Picture it now. You're hauled into the chapter house, your sin laid bare. The cold stones press into your knees as the brothers file past. Some glance at you with pity, others with satisfaction, knowing they avoided your fate for now. The abbot's voice rises, condemning lust, reminding everyone that your body is weak and your soul endangered. You're both punished and paraded, both humiliated and instrumental. Your suffering becomes a sermon without words, and yet the same cycle repeated. Humiliation did not cure desire, it merely postponed it. Monks endured their penance, muttered their confessions, and returned to their cells where the same temptations waited. The monastery became a revolving door of fear, shame, and failure. What was supposed to be the purest life often became the most tortured. Still, the system endured for centuries, not because it worked, but because it served the institution. Fear kept order, and order preserved the monastery. The individual monk might crumble under shame, but the cloister itself remained strong, and the punishments, however bizarre, became traditions passed down from generation to generation. Each new novice warned not only of hell, but of humiliation in front of his peers. And when shame and sermons failed, the church turned to something even more elaborate. Not just punishments, not just fear, but rituals of exorcism. For when lust was too strong to be explained as human weakness, it was blamed on the devil himself, a force that had to be driven out with prayers, relics, and holy water. When humiliation failed to crush desire, the monastery had another explanation ready. Lust, they claimed, was not only weakness, it was the devil himself creeping into your body. To crave a touch, to feel a pulse in the blood, was to host a demon, and demons demanded eviction. The monastic imagination turned sexual desire into a cosmic battlefield, where every erection was a skirmish with hell itself. This was not just colourful language. Medieval theology explicitly described lust as a demon's work. The incubus and succubus were the most infamous of these imagined creatures. The incubus was thought to sneak into the cells of sleeping monks, mounting them in the night, forcing sinful dreams and emissions. The succubus was even worse, a female demon whose role was to seduce and drain the very vitality of her victim. For the anxious monk, every nocturnal accident could be explained not as biology, but as demonic sabotage. Guilt transformed into horror. Exorcisms became the last resort when confessions, punishments, and fasting did not quiet the flesh. Records show priests sprinkling holy water on monks suffering carnal temptations, chanting psalms over them as if the devil was hiding under their robes. Some abbots carried relics into the dormitories, placing bits of saints' bones near the beds to ward off demons. Imagine trying to sleep with a skull fragment propped on the shelf above your head, all because you dreamed too vividly last week. The absurdity becomes clear when you realise how often medical explanations were ignored. By the 12th century, physicians already had some understanding of nocturnal emissions and the body's natural rhythms, but monks preferred demons to biology. It was safer, in a twisted way, to claim that Satan had climbed into your bed than to admit your body had betrayed its vow. If you blamed the devil, you could be treated as a victim. If you admitted weakness, you were a sinner. The theological dodge became a survival strategy. Some monasteries went further. They ritualized the fight against lust with prayers specifically targeting demons of the flesh. One famous medieval prayer begged for deliverance from spirits of fornication and nocturnal pollution. The language dripped with fear, as if every dream carried sulphur on its breath. Monks were told to make the sign of the cross over their bodies before sleep, tracing holy geometry on their chests and groins, a sacred fence against demonic invasion. If you thought sleeping with a crucifix under your pillow was extreme, try carving protective crosses into your wooden bed frame as some monks did, hoping splinters were better than sin. The paranoia was fed by stories circulating through monasteries. Chronicles told of monks attacked by succubi who left them weak, pale and trembling. One story described a monk so harassed by nocturnal demons that he collapsed during choir prayers. Another tale warned that demons could take the shape of fellow monks, luring the weak into scandalous encounters. These accounts blurred reality and fear until every glance across the refectory could spark suspicion. Was your brother in Christ, or was he secretly a demon in disguise? And it was not only men who were suspected of carrying demons. Medieval monks feared women profoundly, believing that women's bodies were natural instruments of the devil. Theologians claimed that even looking at a woman too long could invite possession. A simple encounter with a washerwoman outside the cloister could spiral into a full-blown crisis of conscience. Monks who fell into temptation sometimes testified that they had not chosen to sin, but had been bewitched, ensnared, or even cursed. It was easier to say you were under a spell than to admit desire was natural. The line between medicine and magic blurred here too. Remedies for lust often mixed prayers with bizarre physical treatments. Some penitential texts advised bloodletting as a cure for desire, based on the belief that too much hot blood in the body created sinful urges. Others suggested cold baths to shock the flesh back into chastity, though many monasteries lacked facilities beyond a freezing trough in the courtyard. Imagine shivering naked in icy water while your brothers muttered psalms nearby, convinced you were wrestling with Satan himself. The extremes of exorcism also reflected medieval attitudes toward control. By blaming demons, the monastery justified its interventions. If your body was possessed, then every restriction, every humiliating ritual was an act of spiritual medicine. The abbot became not just a leader but an exorcist, policing souls as much as flesh. Discipline, humiliation, fasting, even chains were reframed as ways of smoking out the devil. The monastery saw itself as both hospital and battlefield, where every bed was an exorcism chamber. But beneath all the ritual and fear, there lingered a quiet irony. By blaming lust on demons, monks kept lust alive in their imaginations. They recited prayers against fornication, told stories of succubi, carved crosses into bed frames, and sprinkled relics around dormitories. In trying to deny desire, they ended up thinking about it constantly, weaving it into theology and liturgy until lust was everywhere. The devil they feared most was often of their own making, conjured not by flesh but by obsession. So when a monk tossed and turned in his straw bed, sweating under the weight of both temptation and terror, he was not just fighting himself, he was fighting an entire worldview that turned biology into blasphemy, dreams into demons, and desire into damnation. His only comfort was the hope that prayers, relics, or humiliating penances would keep the incubus at bay for one more night. And yet, even exorcisms could not silence everything. If demons haunted the dormitory, another danger haunted the monastery's confessional books. The careful recording of sins. Monks wrote them down, catalogued them, archived them, building centuries of manuals on how to punish the flesh. Which means the monastery's greatest legacy was not purity, but paperwork,